This article is from the Marshall Project. In New York prisons, guards who brutalize prisoners rarely get fired. Records obtained by the Marshall Project reveal a state discipline system that fails to hold many guards accountable. Shattered teeth, punctured lungs, broken bones. Over a dozen years, New York State officials have documented the results of attacks by hundreds of prison guards on their people in their custody. But when the state corrections department has tried to use this evidence to fire guards, it has failed 90% of the time. An investigation by the Marshall Project has found. Pause. Can you just imagine that? 90% of the occurrences in which the New York State Department of Corrections have tried to terminate an employee, a corrections officer, they have failed 90%. That's an astronomically high percentage of people. And in those cases where they have attempted to terminate those correction officers, the abuse in those cases must have been very, very, very bad. Continuing on with the article. The review of prison disciplinary records dating to 2010 found more than 290 cases in which the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision tried to fire officers or supervisors it said physically abused prisoners or covered up mistreatment that ranged from group beatings to withholding food. The agency considered these employees a threat to the safety and security of prisons. Yet officers were ousted in just 28 cases. The state tried to fire one guard for using excessive force in three separate incidents within 3 years and failed each time. He remains on the state prison's payroll. An officer who broke his baton, hitting a prisoner 35 times, even after the man was handcuffed, was not fired. Neither were the guards who beat a prisoner at Attica Correctional Facility so badly that he needed 13 staples to close gashes in his scalp. Nor were the officers who battered a man with mental illness, injuring him from face to groin. The man hanged himself the next day. In dozens of documented cases involving severe injuries of prisoners, including 3 deaths, the agency did not even try to discipline officers, state records show. Horrible. Now we have an infographic here. From January 2010 through April 2022, New York's corrections agency filed 5,642,000 disciplinary cases against prison staff. Each scene here represents roughly a dozen cases. Now, mind you, this is something we have to pay close attention to. This is not incarcerated individuals filing these cases. This is docs themselves filing 5,642 disciplinary cases against prison staff throughout that 12-year period. Let's continue on. The Corrections Department tried to fire employees in 3,953 of those cases for various misconduct. The department tried to fire guards accused of abusing prisoners or covering up such attacks in 294 cases. The department succeeded in firing 28 correctional officers. What a minuscule number of correction officers to be fired who attacked inmates, who mistreated them. It's disgusting. Almost all the guards in the remaining 266 cases stayed on the job. For decades, the workings of the prison discipline system has been hidden from public view under a secrecy law adopted at the urging of the state's powerful law enforcement unions. But after the legislature repealed that law in 2020, the Marshall Project obtained more than 5,600 records of disciplinary cases against prison employees for issues ranging from physical abuse of prisoners to sleeping on the job. The records probably reflect only a fraction of the violence guards have inflicted in New York's correction system, experts said. Many prisoners do not file complaints because they fear retaliation or not being believed. And in most of the state's 44 prisons, officers do not wear body cameras. Mind you, this article is from 2023, which sometimes help prove abuse. These records do not detail prisoner attacks on officers, which the department and the guards union said have increased in recent years. So it's ironic because the union is saying that attacks on guards have gone up. These body cams could easily prove that is the case, but they're not wearing body cams. Back to the article. A key reason the prison system finds it so hard to get rid of guards is the contract the state signed in 1972 with the union. The agreement requires any effort to fire an officer to go through binding arbitration using an outside arbitrator hired by the union and the state, a system the union has successfully kept in subsequent contracts. Only a court can overturn arbitration decisions. Pause for a second. This is one thing I keep saying needs to be eradicated with the collective bargaining agreement. We have to remove this process of going through a third party arbitrating. Back to the article. In abuse cases, the arbitrators ruled in favor of officers 3/4 of the time. A Marshall Project review of nearly 120 decisions shows arbitrators, most of whom are lawyers, often said the state's evidence was insufficient or found prisoners' testimony unconvincing. Just pause for a second. So we see the narrative that because you are an incarcerated individual, anything you have to say is untrustworthy, is not worthy of sincere consideration. Back to the article. Rather than go to arbitration, the state sometimes withdraws charges or officers choose to resign or retire. Guards accused of abuse are often suspended without pay. A 3-month suspension is most common, the analysis found. The abuse by guards has not just left prisoners with lasting injuries, it has also exposed the corrections department to liability in legal cases. The state paid more than 18 million as a result of lawsuits alleging excessive force the Marshall Project has found. Pause for a second. Just think about this. If you live in New York State, $18 million has gone toward settlements and trial victories. That's a waste of taxpayer money. Back to the article. The state's weak record on firing officers was not limited to cases of excessive force. Overall, the corrections department has tried to oust staff members almost 4,000 times since 2010 for such infractions as chronic tardiness and drug use. It succeeded in just 7% of those cases. Wow, just imagine this. The New York State Department of Corrections, they've tried to terminate uh, staff 4,000 times since 2010, and just 7% of those cases they were able to terminate them. That's no way any business, any employer um, can operate by not having the ability to terminate people. It's mind-boggling. Back to the article. The agency said it takes officer accountability seriously and has zero tolerance for violence within its prisons. Daniel F. Marchicello III, the Corrections Department Executive Deputy Commissioner, said in an interview that the number of officers accused of abuse is a small subset of the department's 16,000 guards. I don't know if I would call this a small subset. Quote, certainly on egregious cases, we want to go all the way to termination, Marchicello said. He said that the overall firing rate was low in part because department officials have settled for less harsh punishments than they originally sought, just as prosecutors do. Many officers are doing a lot of great things within our system, Marchicello added, and helping incarcerated individuals. I would really question this statement when you have a culture, a workforce that engages in abuse, engages in corruption, and engages in criminal acts. Mind you, these acts that are occurring at DOCS facilities are criminal. Back to the article. The New York State Correctional Officers and Police Benevolent Association represents the guards. Its president, Michael Powers, said in a statement that the union's job is to negotiate fundamental due process rights in employment decisions. While the small number of bad officers responsible for wrongdoing should be held accountable, he added, the union vigorously defends its members from false allegations by the incarcerated community, and a neutral third party renders decisions based on the facts and evidence presented. The union has said officers have faced a growing number of assaults by prisoners, though the correction system defines assaults broadly, counting incidents involving no physical contact or injury. Pause for a second. Think about that. They're counting as assaults, the Department of Corrections, incidents with no physical contact or injury. Is it a situation where you have someone incarcerated that says to someone, boo or you suck, and they consider this an assault? Just again, this boggles the mind. Everyone should be pissed off. The department has also noted a jump in injuries to staff and prisoners since 2020. The Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that corrections officers have one of the highest rates of job-related injury and illnesses, with the injuries often stemming from confrontations with prisoners. Pause. Yeah, that could be the case that they're getting injured, but how many of these cases, these injuries, are provoked by the officer themselves? Probably a large number of them. The correction officers union contract expired at the end of March. The office of Governor Kathy Hochul is negotiating a new contract, and a spokesperson said it hoped to reach an agreement with the union soon. Quote, Governor Hochul strongly condemned violence in all forms. The spokesperson, Hazel Campton Hayes, wrote in an email. She added that the office will continue to work with the corrections agency to improve safety throughout the system. Pause for a second. So this statement from Governor Kathy Hochul is a pre-canned media statement. It means absolutely nothing. You can scream to the high heavens that you condemn violence, but in terms of what you do about it, what you allow to continue is another story. Back to the article. In the past, the union has wielded significant political influence, especially in rural communities that are home to prisons and their workers. It has put up billboards and held regular news conferences opposing limits on solitary confinement and calling attention to assaults on officers. The union has succeeded in protecting members' jobs, even as the number of people incarcerated has plunged by nearly half since 2010, and the state shut 24 prisons. The number of officers have fallen about 22%, leaving the state with about one guard for every two prisoners, among the highest staffing ratios in the country. Guards made an average of 87,000 last year. though pay of more than 100,000 was not uncommon. According to a Marshall Project analysis of payroll data from the Empire Center for Public Policy, $87,000 in average pay of a New York State correctional officer, and many make more than $100,000 a year. In 2018, Democrats won control of the state legislature, and some of them have been critical of the Corrections Department's failure to discipline officers accused of abuse. Quote, "This is a systematic cultural problem within the department," said State Senator Julia Salazar, a Brooklyn Democrat who chairs the committee that oversees prisons. "It's just a massive betrayal of the public trust that past efforts to give the Corrections Department more power to discipline its employees failed." In 2016, the New York Times reported that the state officials vowed to beef up investigations into brutality after an arbitrator reinstated an officer with back pay, even though the guard had been caught on video repeatedly punching a prisoner lying on the floor. A jury acquitted the guard of assault, however, and attacks on prisoners continue. 2 years later, Governor Andrew Cuomo pushed legislation to give the corrections commissioner the power to dismiss officers, but the plan withered under opposition from the Assembly and Senate. That's hard to believe, but in 2019, state officials negotiated a rare change to the disciplinary system. The new three-person arbitration panels for serious cases, which might have given the state more power to fire guards. But that system has never been used. A correction spokesman blamed the coronavirus pandemic. A powerful union can undermine safety in prisons by gumming up the disciplinary process, said Steve J. Martin, who has worked as a consultant for corrections facilities across the country and is now the court-ordered monitor for the New York City jails on Rikers Island. Officers know they can beat the system more often than not, Martin said. That's how you develop these cultures where you have frequent instances of excessive force. With prisoners unable to rely on the state to discipline officers accused of abuse, many have turned to the courts for help. When Carl Taylor, a prisoner at Sullivan Correctional Facility, died in 2015, his family sued, alleging guards had beaten him for refusing to clean his cell. The state settled during the trial for $5 million and agreed to install cameras at the prison, which is near Monticello, New York. But the department did not file disciplinary actions against any of the officers involved. The agency noted that a grand jury did not indict the guards. Let's pause for a second. Let's really allow this to soak in. Carl Taylor, an incarcerated individual, died in 2015 after being beaten. No disciplinary actions were taken against the officers, and the agency noted that a grand jury did not indict the guards. A man is dead. A man is dead. Back to the article. The Marshall Project identified more than 160 excessive force lawsuits that the state lost or settled, paying $18.5 million in damages. The Corrections Department records show that officials attempted to discipline an officer in just 20 of those cases. They fired 6 guards. More than 65 officers were defendants in multiple suits. As we see with the Robert Brooks murder, several of those officers are defendants in other civil suits. So they continue to abuse. Hundreds of lawsuits, the state settled or lost over 10 years on behalf of the corrections agency. 161 cited physical abuse of prisoners by guards. In 20 of those cases, the department disciplined a guard. Only 6 were fired. While settlements are not an admission of guilt, they can serve as an indicator of abuse. The prisoners must provide enough evidence of misconduct for their lawsuit to survive their initial court challenges. Prisoners face steep obstacles when pursuing lawsuits over abuse. Many such suits are dismissed, often for procedural mistakes or a lack of evidence. Few private lawyers take such cases, which are hard to win and seldom financially rewarding. In 23 suits, prisoners settled for $1,000 or less. Wow, that's nothing. Often, incarcerated people end up representing themselves against experienced lawyers from the state attorney general's office, which defends both the corrections department and officers. Pause for a second. As as you may or may not know, the New York State Attorney General currently, Letitia James, has continued to defend correction officers. So when you think of incarcerated loved ones filing civil suits, that's who they have to fight against. The New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, and her office. Nearly a third of the payouts in excessive force lawsuits went to prisoners who acted as their own lawyers, records show. To win a case from behind bars is an extraordinary feat, said Karen L. Martaw, executive director of Prisoners Legal Services of New York, which provides lawyers to incarcerated people. They can't afford an expert, she said. They never litigated before. They don't know how to pick a jury. If you found value in this video, please consider joining and becoming a member. The first and second tier memberships are both less than the price of a Starbucks cup of coffee. It helps financially support the channel. If not, no worries. Feel free to like the video, comment on the video below, share the video, and if you feel that I've earned it, please subscribe to the channel. My goal is to give you honest and direct feedback and go deeper than what the mainstream media is telling and showing you. Take care, God bless, and see you next time.